We've all felt that moment when everything we thought we knew about ourselves crumbles in an instant. For King Roran, that moment comes not in battle, but when he catches the scent of a woman who should be his enemy. But what begins as a biological pull becomes something deeper when Roran discovers she carries the blood of the rival dynasty he thought extinct. As political threats circle the throne and tradition demands he take an heir, Roran is torn between his crown and a bond he never expected. Elira must decide whether to resist or reshape the very role she was born into. In a world built on dominance and submission, the story questions who truly holds the power, those who conquer or those who endure. But when the scent of destiny mingles with the smoke of conquest, will their forbidden connections save the kingdom or destroy it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the stone battlements of Castle Ravencrest like memories that refused to fade. King Roran Blackthorn stood at his tower window, watching the sun pierce through the grey veil that shrouded his kingdom. At 34, he bore the weight of a crown inherited through blood and conquest, his broad shoulders carrying the expectations of a realm built on the bones of his enemies. The scars that traced along his left temple spoke of battles fought and won, but the deeper wounds, the ones that carved hollow spaces in his chest, remained invisible to all but himself. Below in the courtyard, his soldiers prepared for another day of maintaining order through strength. The kingdom of Valyria had known little but war for the past 2 decades, ever since his father, King Magnus, had crushed the last remnants of the rival Thornwick dynasty. Peace, Roran had learned, was merely the absence of active rebellion, a temporary state that required constant vigilance to maintain. The heavy oak door to his chambers creaked open, admitting Lord Aldrich Wynne, his chief advisor and the closest thing to a friend that a king could afford. Aldrich's silver hair was meticulously groomed despite the early hour, his dark eyes sharp with the intelligence that had made him invaluable to 2 generations of Blackthorn rulers. "Your Majesty," Aldrich said, offering a precise bow. "The reports from Millhaven have arrived." Millhaven. The name tasted bitter on Roran's tongue, though he hadn't spoken it aloud. The village had been a thorn in his side for months, a small settlement that had dared to resist the crown's authority, harboring dissidents and refusing to pay the tribute demanded of all subjects. Such defiance could not be tolerated, not when other settlements watched to see how their king would respond. "Casualties?" Roran asked, turning from the window. His voice carried the measured tone he'd cultivated over years of rule, neither cruel nor kind, but absolute in its authority. "Minimal among our forces. The villagers offered little resistance once Captain Gareth breached their defenses. Most were taken alive, as you commanded." Aldrich paused, studying the king's expression. "There is, however, something unusual in the captain's report." Roran raised an eyebrow, gesturing for Aldrich to continue. "The villagers had a healer, a young woman who tended their wounded, even as our men secured the settlement. Captain Gareth noted her unusual composure under the circumstances. She showed no fear, Your Majesty. Even when confronted by armed soldiers, she continued her work as if their presence was merely an inconvenience." "Defiant to the end," Roran mused, though something in the description stirred an unexpected curiosity. In his experience, there were 2 types of people who showed no fear in the face of overwhelming force: the foolishly brave and those who had already lost everything that mattered. "This healer, she was brought with the other prisoners?" "Yes, Your Majesty. They arrived before dawn and are currently housed in the lower cells, awaiting your judgment." The lower cells, dark stone chambers beneath the castle where the air was thick with dampness and the weight of countless prisoners who had passed through before. Roran had visited those cells many times over the years, delivering justice as he saw fit, but something about this particular group of prisoners unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite name. Arrange for me to see them, he said finally. This afternoon, after I've reviewed the other matters requiring attention. Aldrich bowed again. Of course, Your Majesty. Shall I have Captain Gareth present to provide additional details? No, I prefer to form my own impressions. Roran moved to his desk, where parchments bearing the royal seal waited for his attention. Trade agreements, tax assessments, marriage proposals from neighboring kingdoms seeking alliance. The mundane business of rule that occupied most of his waking hours. Speaking of which, have the noble houses responded to my announcement regarding the selection of a queen? The question had been weighing on him for months, pushed forward by his council's increasingly insistent reminders that the kingdom required an heir. At 34, he was well past the age when most kings took a mate, but the prospect of binding himself to another for political advantage held little appeal. He had seen what such arrangements produced: cold marriages built on duty rather than genuine partnership, children raised by servants while their parents maintained separate lives within the same castle walls. Several have expressed interest. Your Majesty, Lady Cordelia Ashworth from the Eastern Territories seems particularly eager for an audience. Her father's lands would bring significant strategic advantages, and her bloodline is unquestionably pure. The word echoed strangely in Roran's mind as he considered the political calculus that governed royal marriages. In their world, bloodlines were everything: alpha lineages that traced back centuries, omega houses that had produced queens and consorts, the complex web of genetic compatibility that ensured strong offspring capable of ruling. It was a system that had served the kingdom well, even if it left little room for personal choice. And the others? Lady Isabella from House Redmont, Lady Vivian from the Northern Duchies, and several foreign princesses whose fathers seek stronger ties with Valeria. Aldrich's tone remained neutral, but Roran detected a hint of encouragement in his advisor's expression. All would make suitable matches from a political standpoint. Suitable. Another word that carried the weight of duty rather than desire. Roran had met most of these women at various court functions over the years, intelligent, well-educated, beautiful in their own ways, yet none had stirred anything in him beyond polite interest. Perhaps that was for the best. Kings who ruled with their hearts rather than their heads rarely maintained their thrones for long. Schedule meetings with each of them over the coming weeks, he said, though the prospect felt more like a military campaign than courtship. But first, I want to deal with the matter of Millhaven. Such defiance cannot go unaddressed, even in a village as small as that one. Shall I prepare the usual proclamations? Public executions tend to discourage similar rebellions in other settlements. Roran considered this. The logic was sound, swift, decisive punishment that served as an example to others who might consider challenging royal authority. It was the approach his father would have taken, the method that had kept the kingdom stable through 2 decades of his reign. Yet something made him hesitate, an instinct he couldn't quite identify. "Let me see them first," he said finally. "Then we'll decide the appropriate response." The afternoon brought with it a subtle shift in the castle's atmosphere. Servants moved with the quiet efficiency that preceded significant events, though most remained unaware of the specific nature of their king's business. Roran made his way through the familiar corridors of Castle Ravencrest, past tapestries that depicted the great victories of his bloodline, and portraits of Blackthorn kings stretching back 7 generations. The lower levels of the castle held a different quality of silence, thicker, heavier, broken only by the distant drip of moisture seeping through ancient stones. The guards stationed at the entrance to the cells straightened as he approached, their expressions a mixture of respect and wariness. Few prisoners who descended to these depths ever saw daylight again. "Your Majesty," Captain Gareth said, stepping forward with a crisp salute. The man bore the weathered look of a career soldier, his graying beard neatly trimmed despite the early return from campaign. "The prisoners have been secured as ordered." "How many?" 18 souls, Your Majesty, mostly farmers and craftsmen, along with their families. The village council members who organized the resistance, and the healer I mentioned. In my report, show me. The first cell held the village council, 5 men of middle years whose defiance had crumbled in the face of royal authority. They looked up as Roran approached, fear replacing whatever courage had driven them to resist his rule. These were simple men who had made a simple mistake, believing that distance from the capital might grant them independence from its demands. They would face execution, as was traditional for those who challenged the crown directly. The second cell contained families, women clutching children, elderly men whose weathered faces spoke of decades working the land that was, ultimately, not truly theirs. These would likely be relocated to other settlements where they could be properly supervised, their labor redirected toward more productive purposes for the kingdom. It was the third cell that gave him pause. She sat with her, back against the stone wall, her auburn hair catching what little light filtered down from the narrow window high above. Her dress, once probably a soft blue, was stained with dirt and blood from her work tending the wounded, but her posture remained straight, unbowed by circumstance. When she looked up at his approach, her green eyes met his directly, not with the defiance of someone trying to prove their courage, but with the steady gaze of someone who had already accepted whatever fate awaited her. "You're the healer," he said, though it wasn't really a question. "I am." Her voice carried the educated accent of someone who had received proper schooling, unusual for a village as remote as Millhaven, though I suspect my services are no longer required. There was something in her scent that struck him immediately, something that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to instincts he had learned to suppress in the name of political necessity. She was an omega, unmated and unbound. But there was more to it than that. Something familiar, though he was certain they had never met. "What's your name?" "Elira." She offered no family name, which was common enough among the lower classes, though her bearing suggested otherwise. "You showed no fear during the attack on your village. Captain Gareth found this noteworthy." A slight smile touched her lips, though it held no warmth. "Fear serves no purpose when there are wounded to tend, Your Majesty. The dead don't care about our political affiliations." The response surprised him with its directness. Most people in her position would beg for mercy or proclaim their innocence. Instead, she spoke as if they were equals discussing philosophy, rather than king and prisoner debating the prisoner's fate. "You're not from Millhaven originally," he observed, noting details that separated her from the other villagers. Her hands, while stained from her work, bore the calluses of someone who had handled books as much as herbs. Her manner of speech, her posture, everything suggested origins far above her current circumstances. "Does it matter where I'm from? We all end up in the same place eventually." The fatalism in her words stirred something unexpected in his chest. Not pity exactly, but recognition. He had spoken similar words to himself in the dark hours before dawn, when the weight of the crown felt heaviest and the loneliness of leadership pressed down like a physical force. "Perhaps," he said finally, "but some journeys are longer than others." As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. "Your Majesty?" When he looked back, she was studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Do you ever wonder if the stories we tell ourselves about necessity and duty are just ways to avoid admitting we're afraid of making different choices?" The question lingered in his mind long after he had left the cells, following him through the evening meal and into the night. When sleep finally came, it brought dreams of green eyes and auburn hair and the strange certainty that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet understand. 3 days passed before Roran found himself returning to the lower cells, though he had not consciously decided to make the journey. He told himself it was routine. A king should personally oversee the treatment of prisoners, especially those whose fate remained undecided. Yet, as he descended the familiar stone steps, he knew the reasoning was hollow. The guard at his post straightened with surprise. Your Majesty, we weren't expecting— Continue your duties, Roran said curtly, waving the man back to his station. He had learned long ago that explanations of royal behavior only invited questions he preferred not to answer. The cells were quiet in the afternoon lull, most prisoners resting or lost in their own thoughts. But from the third cell came the soft sound of humming, a melody he didn't recognize, gentle and somehow mournful. As he approached, he saw Elira sitting beside an elderly man whose breathing came in labored gasps. "Lung fever," she said without looking up, apparently having sensed his presence. "It's common in cells like these. The dampness settles in their chests, and without proper herbs," she shrugged, a gesture that spoke volumes about the limitations of her current situation. "You weren't given permission to treat the other prisoners." "No." "Your Majesty, I wasn't." She finally looked at him, those green eyes steady and unrepentant. "Would you prefer I let him die in discomfort? I thought kings were supposed to be merciful to the weak." The challenge in her words was subtle but unmistakable. Another prisoner might have groveled or made excuses. Elira simply stated facts and let him draw his own conclusions about what kind of ruler he chose to be. "You assume I intend mercy for any of you, don't you?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than accusation. "If you meant to execute us immediately, we would already be dead. The fact that we're still breathing suggests you're considering alternatives." Her reasoning was sound, which irritated him more than he cared to admit. He had indeed been postponing the final decisions about the prisoners, telling himself it was due to other pressing matters requiring attention. The truth was more complicated. "Tell me about your village," he said, settling against the wall opposite her cell. The action was beneath his dignity as king, but something about her presence made formal protocols feel unnecessarily burdensome. "What would you like to know? Why they resisted?" Millhaven was small, isolated. They couldn't have hoped to stand against royal forces. Elira was quiet for a long moment, her attention seemingly focused on the sick man beside her. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested the story was personal. "They were afraid," she said finally. "The crown's demands for tribute had increased 3 times in as many years. The harvest was poor, and taking what you required would have meant starvation for the children come winter. They thought if they could prove they were loyal subjects who simply couldn't meet the current demands, perhaps some accommodation might be reached." Accommodation. He tasted the word, finding it foreign. His father had taught him that accommodation was another word for weakness, and weak kings didn't keep their thrones for long. They sent no embassy, requested no audience. They simply stopped paying what was owed. "Would you have granted an audience to a group of farmers from a village most of your courtiers couldn't find on a map?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. The honest answer was no. Such requests rarely reached his attention, filtered out by advisors who deemed them unworthy of royal time. But admitting that felt like conceding some essential point in their verbal sparring. "That's not how governance works," he said instead. "Laws apply equally to all subjects, regardless of their circumstances." "Do they?" She turned to face him fully now, and something in her expression had shifted, become more intense, more focused. "Do the noble houses pay the same tribute as farming villages? Do they face execution when they fall behind on their obligations?" Noble houses provide different services to the crown: military support, political alliance. "They provide what they can afford to lose," Elira interrupted, her voice carrying an edge he hadn't heard before. "Just as Millhaven provided what it could afford to lose. The difference is in how you measure value." The conversation was moving into dangerous territory, the kind of philosophical debate that could easily be interpreted as sedition. Yet Roran found himself reluctant to end it. When had anyone last challenged his perspective so directly? His advisors offered counsel, but always within the accepted frameworks of royal prerogative. His potential queens would speak of mutual advantage and strategic necessity. Elira spoke as if his choices actually mattered, as if he had the power to be something other than what 2 decades of kingship had made him. "You speak with unusual knowledge for a village healer," he observed. Something flickered across her face, too quick to interpret, but unmistakably significant. "I've had an unusual education." "Explain." She was quiet again, and this time the silence stretched long enough that he began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "My mother believed knowledge was the one thing that couldn't be taken from you, no matter what else you lost. She made sure I learned to read, to think, to question what I was told." Elira's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where a thin chain disappeared beneath her dress. "She died when I was 16. After that, the learning became more practical." "Your father?" "Gone long before that." The finality in her tone suggested the topic was closed, but Roran pressed anyway. "How?" "In service to his king." The words carried a bitter edge that made him wonder what service had cost her family. He believed in duty, in loyalty, in the idea that good men who served faithfully would be rewarded. He died believing it. Many good men die in service to the crown. Their sacrifice ensures the kingdom's stability. Their sacrifice ensures that kings can sleep peacefully while other people pay the price for their decisions. Elira's eyes met his directly, and for a moment he saw past the careful composure to something raw and angry beneath. "Tell me, Your Majesty, when you order men to die for your policies, do you ever think about their children, about the wives who'll never see them return, or do they become acceptable losses in service to some greater good?" The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were untrue, but because they were too true. Every king learned to think in terms of necessary sacrifice, individual lives weighed against broader strategic objectives. It was the mathematics, a rule, cold and essential and utterly without sentiment. "You think leadership means never having to make hard choices," he said, his voice harder now. "You think there's always a path that avoids suffering, if only the ruler is wise enough to find it. I think there's a difference between unavoidable suffering and suffering caused by unwillingness to consider alternatives." She leaned forward, her intensity increasing. "When did you last visit a village like Millhaven, Your Majesty? When did you last see what your tribute demands actually cost the people who pay them? Kings don't have the luxury of sentiment." "Sentiment." Her laugh was sharp and humorless. "I'm talking about information. How can you make good decisions about people you've never bothered to understand?" The argument was interrupted by approaching footsteps. Captain Gareth appeared at the end of the corridor, his expression apologetic but determined. "Your Majesty, Lord Aldrich requires your immediate attention. A matter of some urgency regarding the prisoner transfers." Roran stood suddenly, aware that he had spent nearly an hour in conversation with a woman who should have been executed days ago. The realization brought with it a wash of conflicting emotions, irritation at the interruption, concern about what Aldrich might have discovered, and beneath it all, an unexpected reluctance to end their discussion. "We'll continue this later," he said to Elira, though the promise seemed to surprise them both. "Will we?" Her smile was enigmatic, neither hopeful nor resigned. "I suppose that depends on what urgency awaits you upstairs." As he followed Captain Gareth from the cells, Roran found himself wondering what she meant. It wasn't until they reached Aldrich's chambers that he understood. His chief advisor was waiting with a small collection of items arranged on his desk, personal effects taken from the Millhaven prisoners during processing. Most were the expected possessions of rural folk, simple jewelry, tools of trade, letters from distant relatives, but one piece stood apart from the rest. "Captain Gareth brought this to my attention," Aldrich said, indicating a silver locket lying, open on a piece of black velvet. "It was found among the healer's belongings." The locket itself was unremarkable, the kind of piece a mother might pass to her daughter, bearing the worn patina of age and frequent handling. But the contents made Roran's blood run cold. Nestled in the small space where a miniature portrait might normally rest was a tiny compartment, And within that compartment, pressed carefully flat, was a piece of wax bearing an unmistakable seal, the royal seal of House Thornwick. "This is impossible," Roran said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The Thornwick line was extinguished. 20 years ago, my father made certain of it. So we believed," Aldrich replied carefully. "Yet here is evidence suggesting otherwise. The seal is authentic. I've compared it to the historical records. The question now is whether this woman knows what she carries, and if so, what she intends to do with it." Roran stared at the locket, his mind racing through implications. If Elira was indeed connected to the Thornwick bloodline, if she was, gods forbid, a legitimate heir to the rival dynasty, then everything about her presence in his kingdom took on a completely different meaning. Her education, her knowledge of royal politics, her fearless manner when speaking to him, suddenly. It all made a different kind of sense. "Have you questioned her about this?" "I thought it best to consult with you first, Your Majesty. If she is who this evidence suggests, the situation becomes delicate. Delicate, another diplomatic word that barely concealed the magnitude of the crisis they might be facing. A living Thornwick heir could legitimately claim the throne of Valyria, not through conquest, as Roran's family had taken it, but by birthright that predated the Blackthorn dynasty by 3 generations. Even if she lacked the military strength to press such a claim, her mere existence could inspire others to rally around her banner. "She stays in the cells for now," he said finally, "but under heavier guard and no contact with the other prisoners. I want to know everything about her, where she's been, how she survived, whether she knows what this locket represents. And if she does know?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. By law and tradition, the correct response was clear. Execute her immediately, before word of her existence could spread beyond these walls. It was what his father would have done, what any practical ruler would do when faced with a threat to dynastic legitimacy. Yet as he looked at the locket, Roran found himself thinking not of political necessity, but of green eyes that met his without flinching, and a voice that asked questions he had been avoiding for years. "If she knows," he said slowly, "then we'll deal with that when we come to it." But even as he spoke the words, he suspected they were both already far beyond the point where simple solutions would suffice. The castle's ancient foundations held secrets that even Roran had forgotten existed. Deep beneath the main keep, where the original builders had carved chambers from living rock, lay passages that had served a dozen purposes over the centuries. Wine cellars, storage vaults, and in darker times, places where inconvenient truths could be buried alongside inconvenient people. It was in one of these forgotten spaces that he stood now, 3 days after the discovery of the locket, watching as Captain Gareth carefully pried stones from a wall that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The work was delicate. Too much force might bring down part of the ceiling. Too little would leave them no closer to the answers they sought. "There," Gareth said finally, setting aside a stone that had borne the weight of others for 20 years. Behind it, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a small wooden box that looked as if it had been placed there yesterday. Roran took the box himself, feeling the smooth wood beneath his fingers. His father had told him about this hiding place during one of their final conversations, when the old king's health was failing and the transfer of power became inevitable. "Some secrets," Magnus had said, "are too dangerous to trust to written records, but too important to let die with the men who know them." The box opened with a soft click, revealing its contents. Documents bearing the seals of both royal houses, a few pieces of jewelry, and at the bottom, a signet ring that perfectly matched the seal in Elira's locket. "The Thornwick royal ring," Roran said quietly, lifting it to the torchlight. "My father claimed it was lost when their castle fell." "Perhaps he thought it was better lost than found," Captain Gareth observed. The man had served 2 kings faithfully, but his loyalty had never extended to unquestioning acceptance of their wisdom. Roran studied the ring, noting how its engravings caught and reflected the flickering flame. House Thornwick's crest was worked into the gold with masterful skill, a crowned stag surrounded by roses, symbols of nobility and growth. It was beautiful work, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke to centuries of accumulated wealth and cultural refinement. His own royal ring, by contrast, bore the blackthorn raven, a bird of prey wreathed in flames. Strength through conquest, power through the willingness to destroy what opposed it. The difference between the two houses couldn't have been more clearly displayed, Your Majesty, Gareth said carefully. If I may ask, what do you intend to do with this knowledge? It was a fair question, and one Roran had been avoiding for days. The practical answer remained unchanged. Execute Elira quietly and let the Thornwick bloodline die with her. It was the safe choice, the choice that preserved stability and ensured the kingdom's future under Blackthorn rule. But increasingly, when he tried to envision that future, he found it strangely hollow, more of what they had always been. A kingdom, held together by fear and tradition, strong enough to survive, but never quite strong enough to thrive. His potential queens would give him heirs who would inherit the same burdens, make the same necessary compromises, rule the same way for the same reasons. I need to speak with her again, he said finally, alone this time. Your Majesty, is that wise? If she truly is Thornwick blood, then she's the most dangerous person in my kingdom, or the most valuable. Either way, I need to understand which. The conversation took place that evening in a chamber Roran had ordered prepared specifically for the purpose. Not a cell this time, but not quite a guest room either. Somewhere that suggested possibility without implying commitment. Elira was brought under heavy guard, but the soldiers were dismissed once she was seated across from him at a small table. She looked different away from the cells, cleaner for one thing, having been allowed access to washing facilities and fresh clothes. But more than that, she seemed to have shed some invisible weight that had pressed on her in captivity. Her posture was straighter, her expression more alert, as if the change in circumstances had awakened something that had been carefully held. In check, you found it, she said before he could speak, her eyes going immediately to the locket that lay open on the table between them. You knew I would. I hoped you would. She reached across the space separating them, her fingers hovering just above the silver surface. May I? He nodded, watching as she lifted the locket with the reverence of someone handling a sacred relic. Her thumb traced the worn edges of the compartment where the seal had rested for so many years. My mother gave this to me on her deathbed, Elira said quietly. She told me it was the last piece of who we used to be, and that someday, when I was strong enough, I would need to decide what to do with that knowledge. She told you what it meant? What you are? She told me I was the last. Elira's voice remained steady, but something in her expression suggested the weight of that revelation had never truly lifted. The last of a line that once ruled this kingdom, with wisdom instead of fear, prosperity instead of mere survival. She told me that I could choose to let it die with me or find some way to honor what came before. And what did you choose? For the first time since he had known her, Elira seemed genuinely uncertain. She set the locket down carefully, her fingers lingering on its surface. I tried to let it die, she admitted. For years I told myself that the past was past, that trying to reclaim something lost would only bring suffering to people who didn't deserve it. I became a healer because healing seemed like the opposite of the violence that destroyed my family. I thought if I saved enough lives, helped enough people, maybe I could balance the scales somehow. But you can't heal a wound by pretending it doesn't exist. She looked up at him then, and he saw in her eyes the same weariness that had driven him to those pre-dawn moments of questioning his own choices. The kingdom is sick, Your Majesty, not dying, but not truly living either. People suffer unnecessarily while others prosper without effort. Justice depends more on birth than on merit. That's not sustainable. You think you could do better? The question came out more challenging than he had intended, but Elira didn't seem offended. "I think we could do better," she said, and the emphasis on the first word was unmistakable. "The Thornwick line ruled for 3 centuries before your family took power. We didn't do it through conquest alone. We did it by building something people wanted to be part of. Alliance instead of subjugation. Growth instead of mere control." "Pretty words," Roran said, though something in him responded to the vision she painted. "But words don't defend borders or maintain order. My father's methods may have been harsh, but they kept this kingdom intact when our neighbors would have carved it up between them. At what cost?" Elira leaned forward, her intensity building. "Yes, you maintained order. The order of people too afraid to speak their minds, too beaten down to hope for something better. You kept the borders secure, but what's inside those? Borders that's worth securing?" The question hung between them like a challenge, and Roran found himself without an immediate answer. He had spent his entire reign focused on maintaining what his father had built, preserving the stability that had been purchased with so much blood. When had he last considered whether that stability served any purpose beyond its own perpetuation? "What are you proposing?" he asked finally. "I don't know." The honesty of the admission surprised him. "I know that killing me would be the safe choice for you, politically speaking. I also know that doing so would guarantee this kingdom never becomes anything more than what it is now. A place where people survive rather than thrive, endure rather than flourish." She stood then, moving to the chamber's single window. Beyond the glass, the lights of the capital city spread out like stars fallen to earth, each one representing lives that depended on the decisions made within these walls. "I've thought about this every day for 20 years, she continued, her back still turned to him. "What I would say if I ever had the chance, what I would ask for, what I would be willing to sacrifice. But now that the moment is here, I realize I don't want to be the last Thornwick any more than you probably want to be, just another Blackthorn king who ruled through fear. What does that mean?" When she turned back to him, her expression was unlike anything he had seen before. Not defiant or resigned, but something that might have been hope, tempered by hard-earned wisdom. "It means maybe there's a third option we haven't considered. Yet," she said, "something that doesn't require either of us to be what our bloodlines expect us to be." As Roran looked at her, silhouetted against the window, he felt something shift in his chest, not the biological pull he had experienced in the cells, but something deeper and more complex. For the first time in years, he found himself genuinely curious about the future, about possibilities that extended beyond mere maintenance of the status quo. It was, he realized, the first time anyone had suggested he might have choices beyond the ones that had been made for him by history and circumstance. The feeling was both liberating and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing that falling might actually feel like flying. Outside the window, the city lights continued to twinkle in the darkness, each one representing a life that might be different, better, if 2 people could find the courage to choose hope over habit, partnership over power, love over legacy. But first, there were other questions that needed answers. Other truths that required excavation from the buried places where inconvenient secrets waited to reshape the world. The pressed flower was tucked between pages of a book Elira had never mentioned, a volume of philosophical treatises that someone had left in her temporary chambers. When Roran found it the next morning during what he told himself was a routine inspection, the delicate petals were still remarkably intact, their purple color faded but unmistakable. Violets, the flower of House Thornwick, chosen by some long-dead king for reasons that had been lost to history. This particular specimen had been carefully preserved, the kind of keepsake a child might save from a moment of particular happiness. On impulse, he opened the book to examine it more closely. The pages were filled with marginalia written in 2 different hands, one the careful script of a tutor, the other the more casual writing of a student. Most of the notes were philosophical in nature, debates about the nature of justice, the responsibilities of rulers, the balance between individual desires and collective needs. But one exchange caught his attention, written in the margins of a chapter about the moral obligations of power. "A good king serves his people, not the other way around," read the tutor's note, below it in what he was beginning to recognize as Elira's handwriting. But what if the people don't know what they need? What if serving them requires making choices? "They'll hate," the tutor's response. "Then you make the hard choice and accept that history will judge whether you were right. But you never stop asking the question." A young woman's reply. "Father never stopped asking. Look how it ended." The aged conversation continued across several pages, a philosophical debate that had clearly taken place over months or years. Reading it felt like eavesdropping on the education of a princess who would never inherit her throne, yet couldn't stop preparing for responsibilities that might never come. "Your Majesty?" Captain Gareth's voice interrupted his reading. "Lord, Aldrich requests your presence in the war room. He says it's urgent." Roran closed the book carefully, but not before noting the page where the flower had been pressed. Later, he would wonder what significance that particular passage had held for her. Something about the nature of sacrifice and whether noble intentions could justify harsh methods. The war room was a chamber Roran had hoped not to see used for several more years. Maps covered the large central table, marked with colored pins that represented troop movements, supply lines, and intelligence reports. Lord Aldrich stood over them with the focused intensity of a man reading omens in scattered bones. "What is it?" Roran asked, though the grim set of Aldrich's expression already suggested the answer would be unwelcome. "Messages from our border scouts," Aldrich said, indicating a cluster of red pins along the kingdom's eastern frontier. "King Matthias of Aldemore has been mobilizing his forces. Nothing overtly hostile yet, but more activity than we've seen in years. He's testing our responses," Roran said, studying the patterns on the map. Matthias was an old enemy, ambitious enough to be dangerous, but cautious enough to avoid direct confrontation without significant advantage. What else? This morning we intercepted a courier carrying sealed letters between Aldemore and two of the northern duchies. The contents were encrypted, but the very fact of the communication is troubling. Matthias has never shown interest in our internal politics before. The implication was clear enough. Somehow, word of Elira's existence had begun to spread beyond the castle walls. The sealed letters almost certainly related to her potential claim to the throne, and the northern duchies had always been lukewarm in their support of Blackthorn rule. "How could they know?" Roran asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Lord Wynne," Aldrich said carefully, "has been asking questions. Discreet inquiries about historical records, genealogical documents, precedents for disputed succession. Nothing that would seem unusual individually, but taken together, you think he's the source of the leak." "I think he's a careful man who understands the value of information and who may believe that having multiple options serves the kingdom's interests better than blind loyalty to any single claimant." The words were diplomatically phrased, but their meaning was unmistakable. Lord Wynne, the man Roran had trusted with the kingdom's most sensitive business for over a decade, was hedging his bets. If Elira's claim to the throne proved legitimate and attractive to the noble houses, Wynne wanted to be positioned as the man who had facilitated her rise rather than opposed it. "Summon him," Roran said. "I want to hear his reasoning directly." "Your Majesty, perhaps it would be better to summon him now." 20 minutes later, Lord Wynne entered the war room with the measured confidence of a man who knew he held valuable cards in a high-stakes game. His silver hair was impeccably groomed, as always, his expression neutral but alert to the tension. "In the room, Your Majesty," he said, offering the precise bow that protocol demanded. "Lord Aldrich mentioned you wished to discuss recent intelligence reports." "I want to discuss your correspondence with King Matthias," Roran said directly. And your inquiries into Thornwick genealogies, and your sudden interest in succession law. To Wynne's credit, he didn't attempt denial or pretend confusion. Instead, he straightened slightly, meeting Roran's gaze with the steady expression of a man who had anticipated this confrontation. "I have served the crown faithfully for 15 years, he said. "In that time, I have learned that information is the most valuable resource a kingdom possesses, more valuable than gold, more powerful than armies. Knowledge of potential threats, knowledge of opportunities, knowledge of alternatives when current policies prove insufficient. You're admitting you've been in contact with foreign powers about internal matters of state. I'm admitting that I've been gathering information that might prove crucial to the kingdom's survival." Wynne moved closer to the map table, his finger tracing the cluster of red pins along the eastern border. "King Matthias has been planning something for months. His mobilization began before the Millhaven prisoners ever arrived at this castle. The question is whether he acts on his plans now depends largely on how we handle the current situation. Explain." "If Elira is eliminated quietly, Matthias will likely proceed with whatever invasion plans he's been developing. He has nothing to gain by waiting, and every reason to believe our kingdom remains divided by the same internal tensions that have weakened us for years." Wynne paused, studying Roran's expression. "But if she's acknowledged and integrated into the power structure, somehow it changes the entire calculation. You're suggesting I legitimize a rival claimant to protect against external threats? I'm suggesting that you consider whether a rival claimant might actually strengthen your position rather than weaken it, if handled correctly." Wynne's voice took on the persuasive tone he had perfected over years of counseling kings. "The noble houses have always harbored some resentment about the circumstances of your family's rise to power. Not rebellion, but a certain reluctance to fully commit. Elira's voluntary acceptance of your authority, perhaps sealed by marriage alliance, would eliminate that reluctance permanently." The suggestion hit Roran like cold water. Marriage alliance, the most traditional solution to dynastic disputes, and one that had somehow never occurred to him, despite days of considering alternatives. "You're proposing that I marry a woman who has legitimate claim to my throne?" "I'm proposing that you marry a woman whose claim to the throne becomes your claim through marriage," Wynne corrected. "The Thornwick bloodline was beloved by many, who now serve you reluctantly. Uniting the houses would create a legitimacy that conquest alone could never achieve." Roran found himself thinking of their conversation the previous evening, of the way Elira had spoken about third options they hadn't considered. Had she already been thinking along similar lines? Was this the possibility she had been hinting at when she suggested neither of them had to be what their bloodlines expected? "And you believe King Matthias would hesitate to invade a kingdom ruled by a Blackthorn-Thornwick alliance?" "I believe King Matthias would find it much harder to justify aggression against a realm that had voluntarily healed its internal divisions and united behind a shared vision of the future." Wynne's smile was slight but knowing. "Particularly if that realm suddenly had the enthusiastic support of noble houses who had previously been lukewarm allies." The logic was sound, even elegant in its simplicity, but it required a leap of faith that went against everything Roran had been taught about power and its preservation. Sharing authority had always been presented as the first step toward losing it entirely. "What makes you think she would agree to such an arrangement?" "What makes you think she wouldn't?" Wynne countered. "She's intelligent enough to understand the political realities. Marriage to you gives her people protection, gives her ideals. A platform for implementation gives her the power to actually change things, rather than simply complain about them. From her perspective, it might be the only way to honor her heritage without destroying the kingdom in the process." As he spoke, Roran realized that Wynne had been thinking about this possibility far longer than the few days since Elira's identity had been discovered. The older man's inquiries, his careful positioning, his communication with external parties, it all suggested a strategy that had been developing for weeks, possibly months. "You've been planning this since before Millhaven fell," he said. Wynne nodded slowly. "I've been planning for multiple possibilities since the day you announced your intention to select a queen. The arrival of prisoners from Millhaven simply provided an opportunity to explore one option I had always considered theoretical. You knew she was there? I suspected someone was there. The village's resistance was more organized than we expected. Their knowledge of royal protocols more sophisticated. When Captain Gareth mentioned the healer's unusual composure and education, it suggested possibilities worth investigating. The admission was both impressive and troubling. Wynne's foresight had potentially saved the kingdom from civil war, but it had also involved manipulating events and people for purposes they had never consented to. "Show me the correspondence with Matthias," Roran said finally. "All of it. And then arrange for me to speak with Elira again. If we're going to consider this path, she deserves to know what's being proposed before others make decisions for her." As Wynne bowed and turned to fulfill the request, Roran found himself wondering whether the man who had served his crown so faithfully for 15 years had been serving him, or simply serving his own vision of what the kingdom needed. Perhaps in the end, the distinction mattered less than the results. But it was a question that would shape how he approached every decision from this moment forward, including the most important decision of his life. The war journal was bound in leather that had once been black, but had faded to deep brown, with age and handling. Magnus Blackthorne had been a meticulous man, recording not just the strategic decisions of his campaigns, but the personal thoughts that had shaped them. Reading his father's private words felt like violating a tomb, but the current crisis demanded understanding that only these pages could provide. "The Thornwick problem must be resolved permanently," read one entry, dated 3 months before the final siege. "It is not enough to defeat their armies or capture their lands. As long as any member of their bloodline lives, they will remain a symbol around which dissent can gather. A king who shows mercy to rival claimants shows weakness to his subjects." Roran traced the familiar handwriting with his finger, remembering the man who had written these words, not just as his father, but as the king who had shaped the realm through will and ruthless pragmatism. Magnus had been 43 when he wrote this entry, 7 years younger than Roran was now, facing challenges that had seemed insurmountable until he had chosen to make them irrelevant through sheer audacity. The next entry was more revealing. "Spoke with Queen Isabella today about the necessity of what comes next. She understands the political logic, but asks whether there might be some alternative that preserves the stability we seek without requiring the elimination of an entire family line. I told her that kings cannot afford such sentiments, but privately I wonder if there might be truth in her concerns. Still, the die is cast. Too much blood has been spilled to turn back now." His mother. Roran had only vague memories of Queen Isabella. She had died when he was 8, claimed by the same fever that had swept through the capital that winter. He had never known she had questioned his father's methods, never imagined that the woman whose portrait showed such serene acceptance of her role had harbored doubts about the brutal choices that had secured their dynasty. The journal continued. Through the months leading up to the final confrontation, Magnus's entries grew shorter, more tactical, as if he had deliberately shut down the part of himself that asked uncomfortable questions. But occasionally, the doubts surfaced again. "Captured 3 Thornwick children today. The oldest is perhaps 14, the youngest barely able to walk. My advisors say they must die with the rest, that mercy shown to children becomes rebellion fostered 20 years hence. I know they are right. I also know that Isabella would have found another way, had she lived to see this choice. She was always better at seeing possibilities I dismissed as impractical sentiment." Roran closed the journal abruptly, unable to continue reading his father's struggle with decisions that had seemed so clear-cut when viewed from the comfortable distance of victory. The man who had raised him with absolute certainty about the necessity of harsh measures had apparently wrestled with those same measures in private, had questioned whether the price of absolute victory was worth paying. "Your Majesty," Elira's voice was soft, but it startled him nonetheless. He had been so absorbed in reading that he hadn't heard her enter the chamber. "You weren't given permission to be here," he said, though there was no anger in his voice. In truth, he was glad for the interruption, glad for any excuse to stop reading his father's increasingly tortured justifications for what was about to happen. "Captain Gareth said you wanted to see me. When I knocked and received no answer, I was concerned you might be ill." She gestured toward the journal in his hands. "Though I see you were simply occupied with heavier matters. Do you know what this is? Your father's war journal from the final campaign against my family." Her tone was matter-of-fact, as if they were discussing the weather rather than the systematic destruction of her bloodline. "I've wondered for years what he wrote. About those decisions, whether he struggled with them or simply saw them as necessary tasks to be completed. You don't seem surprised that I'm reading it." "I'm not. A wise king seeks to understand the choices that shaped his inheritance, even when, especially when, those choices were difficult ones." She moved closer, and he found himself studying her expression for signs of the anger or grief such proximity to her family's destruction should have inspired. Instead, he saw only a calm attention, as if she were waiting for him to reach some conclusion she had already arrived at. "He had doubts," Roran said finally, "about the necessity of what he did, about whether there might have been alternatives. Of course he did. Only a monster would exterminate an entire family without questioning the choice. Your father wasn't a monster, just a man who believed he was protecting something more important than his own conscience." The generosity in her response surprised him. He had expected accusations, demands for justice, the kind of righteous anger that would make his own choices clearer by contrast. Instead, she offered understanding that made those choices more complicated than ever. "Why aren't you angry?" Elira was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on something beyond the chamber's windows. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years of careful thought. "I was angry," she said. "For a long time, anger was all I had left of my family, the only way I could honor them, the only proof that their lives had mattered. But anger is exhausting when you carry it alone, and destructive when it becomes the only truth you can see." "When did it change?" "When I realized that my family wouldn't have wanted their memory preserved through hatred. The Thornwick kings were known for their wisdom, their ability to build rather than simply tear down. Spending my life plotting revenge would have been a betrayal of everything they represented." She moved to the window, looking out over the courtyard where soldiers practiced their drills. "Besides, what would revenge accomplish? Your father is dead, unable to answer for his choices. You were a child when those decisions were made. Punishing you for his actions would be no more just than what he did to my family. Some would say you have a duty to reclaim what was stolen. Some would say you have a duty to eliminate me before I can become a threat." Her smile held no malice, only a kind of weary recognition. Both perspectives assume that duty is more important than wisdom, that we're bound to repeat the mistakes of the past simply because they're our inheritance. Roran found himself moving toward her, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Not just physical attraction, though that was certainly part of it, but a deeper recognition of kindred purpose. She turned as he approached, and for a moment, they stood close enough that he could smell the subtle scent that had first caught his attention in the cells. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, though he thought he might already know the answer. "I'm suggesting that maybe we don't have to be prisoners of other people's choices," she said. "Maybe we can choose who we want to be, independent of what our bloodlines expect of us." Her hand rose to rest against his chest, just over his heart, and he felt the warmth of her touch like a brand. I know what Lord Wyn has proposed. Marriage alliance, unification of the houses, elimination of the political tensions that have kept this kingdom from reaching its potential. It's a logical solution to an otherwise impossible problem. And logic isn't enough. If we're going to build something that lasts, something worth building, it has to be based on more than political convenience. Her green eyes met his directly, searching for something she apparently found. It has to be based on genuine partnership, mutual respect, shared vision of what we want to create together. You're talking about love. The word felt strange on his tongue. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it had never seemed relevant to the decisions that shaped kingdoms. I'm talking about choosing love, even when duty and tradition offer easier paths. Her other hand joined the first, framing his face with gentle pressure. I'm talking about the possibility that two people who should be enemies might find something in each other worth building a future around. The kiss began tentatively, almost hesitantly, as if they were both afraid of confirming what they had been circling around for days. But when she didn't pull away, when her response proved that the attraction he had felt was genuinely mutual, hesitation gave way to something deeper and more urgent. When they finally separated, both were breathing harder, and the political implications of what had just happened seemed simultaneously more complicated and less important than they had moments before. "This changes everything," he said. "No," she corrected, her forehead resting against his. "This clarifies everything. The question now is whether we're brave enough to choose the future we want instead of accepting the one other people expect." Outside the window, the sun was setting over the capital city, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in that city, Lord Wyn was probably crafting letters to foreign courts, updating his careful calculations based on new information. Somewhere, King Matthias was moving troops and planning campaigns that might never be necessary. Somewhere, the future of the kingdom was being shaped by decisions that hadn't been made yet by people who were still learning who they wanted to become. But in this chamber, with Elira's warmth still lingering on his lips, and his father's journal lying forgotten on the table, Roran felt for the first time in years that the future might be something to anticipate rather than simply endure. The letter arrived during the morning meal, delivered by a courier whose mud-splattered condition suggested he had ridden hard through the night. Captain Gareth brought it directly to the high table where Roran was breaking his fast with several members of his inner council. The wax seal was intact, bearing the three-headed dragon crest of King Valdris of Morwen, a neighbor who had maintained careful neutrality in regional conflicts for the better part of a decade. "Urgent correspondence from the Eastern Kingdoms, Your Majesty," Gareth said quietly, presenting the letter with the discretion that such communications required. Roran broke the seal carefully, aware that the eyes of his advisors were upon him as he read. Valdris was known for his diplomatic subtlety, but this message was uncharacteristically direct. "Brother King," it began, "word has reached our court of certain developments within your realm that may be of mutual interest. Specifically, we have heard rumors concerning the survival of certain bloodlines previously thought extinct. Such matters have implications that extend beyond any single kingdom's borders. We write to inform you that King Matthias of Aldemore has been in correspondence with several houses within our own realm, seeking support for what he terms restoration of legitimate rule to Valyria. While we have given no commitment to such ventures, we felt honor-bound to inform you of these discussions so that you might respond as wisdom dictates. We remain, as always, committed to the preservation of stability in our region and would welcome dialogue about how such stability might best be maintained in light of current circumstances." The message was signed with Valdris's personal seal, indicating this was not mere diplomatic courtesy, but genuine concern about regional developments that could affect multiple kingdoms. "What does it say?" Lord Wyn asked, though his tone suggested he might already have some idea. "King Matthias is actively seeking foreign support for intervention in our internal affairs, Roran replied, setting the letter aside. He's apparently positioned this as a matter of restoring legitimate rule rather than simple conquest. The implications were clear to everyone at the table. Matthias had somehow learned enough about Elira's identity to present her claim as a justification for military action. Whether he intended to support her rule or simply use her as a pretext for his own ambitions mattered less than the fact that the secret was no longer contained within Valeria's borders. "How much do they know?" asked Lord Brennan, the kingdom's treasurer and one of the few men Roran trusted completely. "Enough to make their case to foreign courts," Wynne replied grimly. "The specific details matter less than the general narrative. Surviving heir to the previous dynasty held captive by usurpers, requiring rescue by righteous neighbors. Even if that narrative bears little resemblance to reality," Roran added. "The idea of Elira as a helpless captive requiring rescue would have been amusing if the political consequences weren't so serious." She had spent their last 3 conversations challenging his assumptions and proposing alternatives to problems he had thought insoluble. "Reality becomes less relevant once armies start marching," Brennan observed. "The question is what we do about it." Before anyone could answer, another interruption, this time from a page who approached with obvious nervousness. "Your Majesty," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper, "Lady Elira requests an audience. She says the matter is urgent and relates to the morning's correspondence." The fact that she somehow knew about Valdris's letter shouldn't have surprised him, but it did. Elira had demonstrated repeatedly that she understood political currents better than most people gave her credit for, but her timing suggested sources of information he hadn't considered. "Bring her here," he said, ignoring the looks that passed between his advisors. If they were going to navigate the crisis that was clearly developing, it would require all available perspectives, regardless of their origin. Elira arrived within minutes, dressed in the simple but well-made gown that had become her standard attire since being moved from the cells. But her expression was anything but simple. There was an urgency in her manner that immediately commanded attention. "Your Majesty," she said, offering a respectful nod that somehow managed to acknowledge his authority while maintaining her own dignity. "Lord Wynne, gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but there are developments you need to know about." "You're referring to King Valdris's message?" "Among other things." She moved to the table, accepting the seat that Lord Brennan offered with a grace that reminded everyone present of her royal heritage. "Your Majesty, how much do you know about the network of correspondence that's been developing between the Eastern Kingdoms over the past month?" The question was directed at Roran, but it was Wynne who answered. "We're aware of increased diplomatic activity. King Matthias has been more communicative than usual, and several other courts have been asking questions about internal developments within our borders." "The questions aren't random," Elira said. "They're being coordinated by someone who understands exactly what leverage each kingdom values most. Matthias has offered territorial concessions to Morwen in exchange for military support. He's promised trade advantages to the northern duchies if they remain neutral during any conflict. He's even approached the southern kingdoms with offers of marriage alliance once he's established control here." "How do you know this?" Roran asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. "Because some of the messages have been delivered through channels that pass near the servants' quarters," she replied calmly. "Servants see everything and are rarely considered worthy of security precautions. A woman who knows how to listen and where to look can learn quite a lot about matters that supposedly require the highest levels of discretion." The admission was both impressive and troubling. If Elira could gather intelligence through servant networks, what else might she have learned during her time in the castle? "What else have you discovered?" Wynne asked, his tone carefully neutral. that King Matthias has been planning this for months, probably since before the Millhaven Rebellion ever began. The timing of that rebellion, the way it was organized, the specific demands they made, all of it fits a pattern that suggests external coordination. You're saying Matthias orchestrated the rebellion? I'm saying someone provided guidance that turned a local dispute over tribute into something that would require royal attention and military response. Someone who knew that crushing such a rebellion would likely result in prisoners being brought to this castle, where their identities could be discovered and used for larger purposes. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If Elira was correct, then the entire sequence of events, from the initial rebellion to the discovery of her identity to the current diplomatic crisis, had been orchestrated by external forces as part of a larger strategy to destabilize the kingdom. That would make you a pawn in someone else's game, Roran said quietly. It would make all of us pawns, she corrected. The question is whether we continue playing by rules other people established, or whether we change the game entirely. How do you propose we do that? Elira reached into the small bag she had brought with her, withdrawing a piece of parchment that she placed on the table before them. By doing something no one expects, something that disrupts every calculation they've made about how this situation will develop. The parchment bore writing in her careful script, not a letter, but what appeared to be a formal document of some kind. "What is it?" Lord Brennan asked. "A proposed treaty between the houses of Blackthorn and Thornwick," she said. "But not a marriage contract, not a surrender, not a negotiated settlement, but a genuine partnership agreement that creates something entirely new." Roran leaned forward to read the document more carefully. The language was formal but clear, establishing terms for joint rule that went far beyond traditional marriage alliances. It outlined shared authority, collaborative decision-making, and a system of governance that drew on the strengths of both bloodlines while addressing the weaknesses that had led to decades of conflict. "You wrote this yourself?" "I had help," she admitted. "Servants aren't the only people in this castle who have been thinking about alternatives to the current crisis. There are members of your own council who believe the kingdom would be stronger with unified leadership than with continued division." "Which members?" Wynne asked, though his tone suggested he might already know. "People who have served the crown faithfully for years but have grown concerned about external threats and internal instability. People who believe that genuine partnership between our houses represents the kingdom's best hope for long-term prosperity and security." Roran found himself studying the faces around the table, wondering which of his trusted advisors had been involved in these discussions without his knowledge. The realization that important conversations about the kingdom's future had been taking place beyond his direct oversight should have been troubling, but instead he found it oddly reassuring. If his people were thoughtful enough to consider alternatives, rather than simply accepting whatever crisis developed, it suggested a level of wisdom and loyalty that went beyond mere obedience. "What specific terms are you proposing?" he asked. "Joint sovereignty, with clearly defined areas of responsibility. You would retain authority over military matters, foreign policy, and traditional royal prerogatives. I would take responsibility for domestic governance, legal reform, and a kind of social programs that address the underlying causes of unrest, like the Millhaven Rebellion. And succession? Our children would inherit both bloodlines and be raised to understand that their authority comes from service to the people, rather than simple birthright." Her voice carried a conviction that suggested this wasn't merely political calculation. The goal would be to create a dynasty that rules through earned respect rather than inherited fear. It was, Roran realized, exactly the kind of third option she had been hinting at for days, something that honored both their heritages while creating possibilities that neither bloodline could achieve alone. More importantly, it was a solution that addressed not just the immediate crisis, but the underlying tensions that had made the kingdom vulnerable to external manipulation. King Matthias wouldn't expect such an arrangement, Lord Brennan observed. His entire strategy depends on our internal division and the assumption that we'll respond to his threats through traditional military means. Exactly, Elira agreed. A unified Valyria presents a completely different set of challenges than a kingdom torn between rival claimants. It also eliminates his justification for intervention, since there would no longer be any oppressed dynasty requiring rescue. Roran found himself thinking about the future such an arrangement might create, not just for the kingdom, but for himself, personally. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for years might finally be replaced by genuine partnership. The burden of absolute authority might be shared with someone who understood both its weight and its responsibilities. But it would also require a leap of faith unlike any he had ever made, trusting not just his own judgment, but someone else's. Wisdom in matters that could determine the survival of everything he had inherited. "I need time to consider this," he said finally. "Of course," Elira replied, "but not too much time. King Matthias won't wait indefinitely for us to resolve our internal affairs, and every day we delay gives him more opportunity to build the alliances he'll need for successful intervention." As she rose to leave, Roran found himself wondering whether the woman walking away from his table was the answer to prayers he hadn't known he was making, or the most dangerous person he had ever encountered. Perhaps, he thought as he watched her go, the distinction mattered less than what they might build together if they could find the courage to try. The chalice was beautiful in the way that only truly expensive things could be, worked silver inlaid with gold, decorated with precious stones, that caught the candlelight and threw it back in brilliant fragments. It sat on Lord Wynne's private dining table like a centerpiece, innocuous among the other fine appointments that marked a successful man's appreciation for luxury. Roran might never have noticed it particularly, if not for the fact that he had seen its twin barely an hour before in Elira's chambers. "An interesting piece," he said casually, lifting the chalice to examine it more closely. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the kind of work that took master artisans months to complete, and cost more than most people saw in a lifetime. "A gift from an admirer in the Eastern Kingdoms," Wynne replied smoothly, though something in his expression had shifted at Roran's interest. "King Valdris sent it along with his letter, as a token of friendship and respect." How thoughtful of him. Roran set the chalice down carefully, his mind racing through implications he was only beginning to understand. "And he sent an identical piece to Lady Elira. What a remarkable coincidence." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. Wynne's carefully composed features didn't change, but his hands, which had been relaxed a moment before, now rested with deliberate stillness on the table's edge. "Your Majesty," he said finally, "perhaps we should discuss, perhaps we should." Roran's voice carried the authority of a king who had just realized he was being played by someone he had trusted implicitly. "Starting with how long you've been in communication with King Matthias, and why you felt the need to keep such correspondence secret from your own sovereign." "I have served this crown faithfully for 15 years, Wynne began, but Roran cut him off with a gesture. "You have served your own vision of what this crown should represent. There's a difference, and I'm only now beginning to understand how significant that difference has been." The accusation hung between them like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. Wynne studied Roran's expression for several long moments before apparently deciding that denials would serve no purpose. "Everything I have done has been in service to this kingdom's stability and prosperity," he said finally. "If that has sometimes required independent initiatives, it was only because the challenges we faced demanded solutions that traditional approaches could not provide." "Independent initiatives?" Roran tasted the euphemism, finding it bitter. Is that what you call orchestrating rebellions in remote villages? Manipulating the discovery of rival heirs? Coordinating with foreign powers to create crises that serve your political objectives? I call it statecraft, Wynne replied, some of his composure returning. The kind of long-term strategic thinking that keeps kingdoms intact, while their rulers focus on immediate concerns. Did you really think the Millhaven rebellion was a coincidence, Your Majesty? A random uprising that happened to provide exactly the catalyst needed to resolve succession questions that have plagued this realm for 20 years. The admission was both shocking and unsurprising. Roran had suspected manipulation, but hadn't imagined the scope of Wynne's orchestration. You arranged for Elira to be discovered. I arranged for the possibility of her discovery, Wynne corrected. The rebellion would have served its purpose regardless, either by eliminating a potential threat through normal military action or by bringing her to your attention so that her existence could be properly managed. I simply ensured that all possible outcomes served the kingdom's interests. And if she had died during the fighting, then the Thornwick line would have ended quietly, and we would have dealt with King Matthias's ambitions through conventional means. Wynne's tone remained steady, as if they were discussing trade agreements rather than the calculated manipulation of human lives. But she survived, which created opportunities that her death would not have provided. Roran felt something, cold, settling in his chest. Not just anger at the betrayal, but a deeper recognition of how thoroughly he had been maneuvered. The marriage proposal, the unification treaty, all of it was part of your design. The proposal was a logical solution to an impossible problem. Whether you and Lady Elira developed genuine affection for each other was a fortunate development. That simplified implementation. You're talking about our relationship as if it were a political tool, isn't it? Wynne leaned forward slightly, his eyes taking on the intensity that had made him valuable as an advisor. Your Majesty, with respect, romantic sentiment is a luxury that kings cannot afford when the survival of their realm is at stake. Whatever feelings you may have developed for Lady Elira, they serve the kingdom's needs remarkably well. I saw no reason to discourage emotions that aligned so perfectly with political necessity. The clinical assessment of what Roran had begun to think of as love was somehow more offensive than outright insult would have been, but beneath the anger, a more troubling realization was taking shape. What's King Matthias's real role in this arrangement? Wynne was quiet for a moment, apparently, considering how much truth the situation required. King Matthias has been a useful external pressure point, he said finally. His ambitions are genuine enough, but his timing has been guided to serve our needs rather than his own. You've been manipulating him as well. I've been providing him with information that encourages certain decisions while discouraging others. The threat of external intervention has been essential in creating the urgency necessary for internal reforms that might otherwise take decades to implement. And if your manipulations had failed, if Matthias had decided to invade regardless of our internal arrangements, then we would have faced that challenge from a position of strength with unified leadership and a legitimate claim that no foreign court could reasonably dispute. Wynne's smile was slight, but confident. I have contingency plans, Your Majesty. I always have contingency plans. The scope of the deception was staggering. Wynne had been playing a game that spanned months, possibly years, manipulating events and people across multiple kingdoms to serve objectives that had never been clearly articulated. The man Roran had trusted with the kingdom's most sensitive business had been conducting his own foreign policy, making his own strategic decisions, implementing his own vision of what Valeria should become. What happens now? Roran asked. Now that I know what you've been doing, what you've been planning, what's your contingency for that development? Now we proceed with the marriage alliance and the unification of the houses, because it remains the best solution to our challenges, regardless of how it was arranged. Win's voice carried the patience of a tutor explaining obvious facts to a slow student. Your personal feelings about my methods matter less than the results they've produced. A unified Valyria under Blackthorn Thornwick rule eliminates the succession crisis, neutralizes the external threat, and creates the foundation for prosperity that has eluded this kingdom for decades. And you continue serving as chief advisor, having proven your willingness to manipulate your own king when it serves your purposes. I continue serving this kingdom's interests, as I have for 15 years, using whatever methods prove most effective. Wyn straightened in his chair, meeting Roran's gaze directly. Your Majesty, you can remove me from my position, you can have me executed for treason, you can rage about betrayal and manipulation as much as you like, but the fundamental reality remains unchanged. The path I have arranged is the only one that leads to stability and prosperity for your people, even if it's built on lies and coercion, especially because it's built on intelligent planning rather than random chance and good intentions. Wyn's composure was maddening in its completeness. Kings who insist on moral purity in their governance typically lose their kingdoms to rulers who are more pragmatic about the requirements of power. The argument was logically sound, which made it more infuriating rather than less. Wyn's methods had been manipulative and deceptive, but they had also been effective. The crisis that had seemed insurmountable days before now had a clear solution that served everyone's interests, except perhaps the interests of people who valued honesty over outcomes. Does Elira know, Roran asked, about your role in orchestrating events, about the extent of your manipulation? Lady Elira is an intelligent woman who understands political realities. I suspect she has drawn her own conclusions about the remarkable series of coincidences that brought her to this castle and this opportunity. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're going to receive, Wyn replied calmly. My methods may be questionable, Your Majesty, but my loyalty to this kingdom's welfare is absolute. If that loyalty requires keeping certain information confidential even from you, then that is what duty demands. The admission was a final insult, not just the betrayal of trust, but the suggestion that Wyn knew better than his king what the kingdom needed and what its sovereign should be told. It was paternalism disguised as service, manipulation presented as wisdom, but it was also, Roran realized with growing fury, probably effective. The marriage alliance would solve their immediate problems. The unified houses would create lasting stability. The kingdom would prosper under the arrangement Wyn had engineered. The fact that it had been built on lies and manipulation might matter to his personal sense of dignity, but it wouldn't matter to the farmers who needed stable governance, the merchants who needed predictable trade policies, or the soldiers who needed competent leadership in times of crisis. What guarantee do I have that you won't continue operating behind my back? He asked finally. That you won't decide some future crisis requires more of your independent initiatives? You have my word that I will serve your crown faithfully and honestly from this day forward, Wyn said. And you have the practical reality that my successful manipulation of this situation has given me everything I wanted, a stable, unified kingdom under competent leadership. I have no reason to scheme further when all my objectives have been achieved. The promise felt hollow, but it was probably the best he could hope for under the circumstances. Executing Wyn would eliminate a valuable advisor and create questions about the marriage alliance that could destabilize everything the man had worked to achieve. Keeping him close meant constant vigilance, but also access to expertise that would be difficult to replace. There will be conditions, Roran said. Of course, no communication with foreign courts without my explicit approval. No initiatives involving other members of my council without my knowledge. No manipulation of domestic affairs without clear authorization. Agreed. And if I discover that you've violated any of these conditions, there will be no second chances and no explanations. You'll be tried for treason and executed within the day. Understood, Your Majesty. The formal acceptance was probably meaningless. A man willing to deceive his king once was certainly capable of doing it again when circumstances demanded. But it established clear boundaries and consequences, which was the best safeguard Roran could implement without destroying everything Wynne had built. Now, he said, standing to signal that the immediate crisis was resolved, I believe we have a wedding to plan. And you're going to help me explain to my future queen exactly how she came to be in a position to accept my proposal. Your Majesty, Wynne said carefully, might it not be better to, Lord Wynne, Roran's voice carried the full authority, of his crown, cutting off whatever rationalization was about to follow. Lady Elira deserves to know the truth about how her choices have been shaped by other people's schemes. If our marriage is going to be built on partnership rather than deception, that requires honesty about what we've inherited from the past. And if she refuses the alliance once she understands how it was arranged, then we'll deal with that possibility when it arises, Roran replied. But we'll deal with it honestly, as people who respect each other enough to share difficult truths rather than comfortable lies. As he left Wynne's chambers, Roran found himself thinking about the conversation ahead with something that was equal parts anticipation and dread. Elira had a right to know how thoroughly she had been manipulated, how many of her choices had been shaped by forces beyond her knowledge or control. She also had a right to decide whether the future Wynne had orchestrated was one she could accept, knowing its origins, or whether she preferred whatever uncertain path lay beyond the comfortable solutions that had been prepared for her. It was, he realized, going to be the most important conversation of his life, and possibly the last one he would have with the woman he had come to love. The banner spread across Elira's work table like a map of possibilities, its silk surface catching the morning light that streamed through the chamber windows. Two heraldic traditions wove together in threads of gold and silver, the blackthorn raven and the thornwick stag sharing the same field, surrounded by roses and flames that somehow complemented rather than competed with each other. It's beautiful, Roran said, though the word felt inadequate for what he was seeing. The craftsmanship was remarkable, but more than that, the design seemed to represent something entirely new, not a conquest of one house by another, but a genuine union that honored both traditions while creating something unprecedented. Lady, Margaret and her seamstresses have been working on it for 3 days, Elira replied, smoothing a section where the embroidery was still being completed. Ever since I told her what we were planning for the assembly, the royal assembly. In 2 days, representatives from every noble house in the kingdom would gather to hear Roran's announcement of his engagement and the terms of the alliance that would reshape Valeria's future. It was a gathering that had been planned for weeks, ostensibly to address the succession question that had been hanging over the realm like a sword. Now it would serve an entirely different purpose. Have you considered what you're going to say? She asked, not looking up from her work on the banners. Final details. I've considered several possibilities, he replied carefully. The conversation with Wynne 3 days prior had left him with more questions than answers, and he still wasn't entirely certain how much of the truth should be shared publicly. The question is how much explanation the situation actually requires. You mean how much explanation you're comfortable providing, Elira corrected, finally meeting his eyes. There's a difference between what the situation requires and what your pride can accept. The observation stung because it was accurate. Part of him wanted to expose Wynne's manipulations publicly, to make it clear that he hadn't been a naive puppet dancing to his advisor's tune. But doing so would raise questions about his fitness to rule, about his ability to control his own council, about whether the marriage alliance was genuine partnership or political necessity. You knew, he said suddenly, the realization crystallizing as he spoke. About Wyn's involvement, about the orchestration, you've known all along. I suspected, she admitted. Too many convenient coincidences, too many perfectly timed developments. Either we were remarkably fortunate, or someone was working very hard to ensure that fortune aligned with particular outcomes. And you said nothing? What would have been the point? Whether Wyn orchestrated our meeting or genuine chance brought us together, the feelings that developed between us are real. The alliance we're proposing serves both our people's interests, regardless of how the opportunity arose. She turned back to the banner, making small adjustments to ensure the symmetry was perfect. Sometimes the origin of a good thing matters, less than what you choose to do with it once you recognize its value. The practical wisdom in her response was both frustrating and admirable. She had apparently reached the same conclusion Roran was still struggling with, that Wyn's manipulation didn't invalidate the relationship that had grown from it, didn't make their shared vision for the kingdom's future any less worthwhile. You don't feel betrayed, used? I feel grateful, she said simply. Without Wyn's scheming, I would probably have lived and died as a village healer, never knowing that I might have had the opportunity to honor my family's legacy in a meaningful way. Yes, I was manipulated, but the manipulation led to something I genuinely want, something that serves purposes larger than my personal comfort. And if the Assembly rejects our proposal, if the noble houses decide they prefer the old arrangements to whatever we're offering, then we'll face that challenge together and find another path forward that serves the kingdom's needs. Her smile was confident but not arrogant. But I don't think they'll reject it. People are tired of uncertainty, tired of conflicts that seem to have no resolution. What we're offering is stability, with the possibility of genuine improvement, rather than just maintenance of existing problems. A knock at the chamber door interrupted their conversation. Captain Gareth entered at Roran's invitation, his expression carrying the focused intensity that marked important developments. "Your Majesty," he said, offering a crisp salute, "we've received additional correspondence from the Eastern Kingdoms. 3 more courts have sent messages expressing interest in the restoration of legitimate rule to Valyria. King Matthias appears to have been more successful in building support than we initially estimated." "How many kingdoms does that make?" Elira asked. 6 that we know of, Gareth replied. "Possibly more that haven't revealed their positions yet. If they coordinated military action, we would be facing overwhelming odds. Unless they no longer have justification for such action," Roran observed. "A unified kingdom ruled by consensual alliance between both bloodlines eliminates their pretext for intervention." "Assuming they accept our announcement as genuine," Gareth said carefully. "There's always the possibility that they'll claim coercion, question the legitimacy of any agreement reached under duress." It was a concern that had been weighing on Roran's mind for days. Foreign courts looking for reasons to justify aggression could always find them if they were determined enough. The success of their strategy depended on presenting a united front that was so clearly in the kingdom's best interests that opposing it would seem petty and self-serving, which is why the Assembly must be convincing, Elira said, apparently, following his thoughts. Not just a political announcement, but a genuine demonstration of partnership that shows we've chosen this path freely and thoughtfully. "Any word from our own allies?" Roran asked Gareth. "Mixed responses, Your Majesty. Some houses are enthusiastic about the prospect of unified leadership, particularly those who have felt caught between competing loyalties for the past 20 years. Others are more cautious, concerned about how power will actually be shared and whether traditional privileges will be preserved." "Understandable concerns," Elira acknowledged. "Change is always frightening, even when it promises improvement. What about the common people? Have there been any reactions from the cities or farming communities?" "Generally positive, from what we can determine. The prospect of leadership that understands both military necessities and domestic concerns appeals to people who have felt neglected by purely aristocratic governance. Gareth paused, apparently considering his next words carefully. There have been some interesting developments in the capital markets as well. What kind of developments? Increased investment in long-term ventures, more optimism about trade expansion, that sort of thing. The merchant classes seem to believe that stable, unified leadership will be good for business. It was encouraging news, but Roran found himself wondering how much of the optimism was based on genuine belief in their proposal and how much was simply relief that the succession crisis might finally be resolved. Either way, it suggested that their announcement would be received favorably by the people who would ultimately be most affected by it. What about security for the assembly, he asked. 6 kingdoms worth of potential enemies create certain risks we need to address. Already handled, Your Majesty. I've doubled the guard rotations, established additional checkpoints on all approaches to the castle, and arranged for trusted men to monitor the activities of foreign representatives. Who will be attending? If anyone is planning disruption, we'll have advance warning. Good. What else do we need to consider? The timing of the announcement itself, Elira said. It should come after we've had the opportunity to address concerns privately with key noble houses, but not so late in the proceedings that it appears to be an afterthought. We want it to feel like the natural culmination of careful planning rather than an emergency response to external pressure. Agreed. I'll speak with Lords Brennan and Ashworth this afternoon, then with the Northern representatives this evening. That should give us a sense of how the proposal will be received before we commit to it publicly. And if the private conversations go poorly, then we'll adjust our approach, Roran replied, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. They had come too far, invested too much emotional and political capital in their vision to abandon it without a fight. But I think we'll find more support than opposition, especially once people understand the alternatives. The alternatives. That was really what everything came down to. Not whether their proposal was perfect, but whether it was better than the continued uncertainty that had plagued the kingdom for months, better than the external intervention that seemed increasingly likely, better than the gradual decline that appeared inevitable if nothing changed. There's one more thing, Elira said, moving to a small table where several documents waited for attention. The formal betrothal contract. Lord Wynne prepared a draft based on traditional arrangements, but I've made some modifications that reflect our actual agreement rather than conventional expectations. She handed him a document that was longer and more detailed than typical marriage contracts. Reading through it, he found language that addressed shared authority, collaborative decision-making, and mutual respect in ways that went far beyond the usual economic and political provisions. This is quite different from what my father's generation would recognize, he observed. Your father's generation didn't face the challenges we're dealing with, she replied. Their solutions worked for their circumstances, but circumstances change. We need arrangements that reflect our realities rather than their traditions. Some of the noble houses will find this unconventional. Some of the noble houses will find it threatening, she corrected, because it suggests that marriage can be partnership rather than acquisition, that authority can be shared rather than hoarded, that tradition can evolve rather than stagnate. Those are dangerous ideas for people whose power depends on maintaining existing hierarchies, and you think the Assembly will accept such dangerous ideas? I think the Assembly will accept practical solutions to immediate problems, she said. The philosophical implications can be debated later, after we've demonstrated that our approach actually works. As he studied the contract more carefully, Roran found himself impressed by both its thoroughness and its optimism. Elira had clearly spent considerable time thinking about how to balance their respective strengths and responsibilities, how to create structures that would support their partnership rather than merely formalize their union. When did you draft this? Over the past week, during the hours when I wasn't working on the banner or meeting with various members of your council about logistics for the Assembly. Her smile was slightly mischievous. I've had considerable time for reflection since being moved to more comfortable quarters. And you're comfortable with all the provisions? Nothing feels like excessive compromise from your perspective? Everything feels like compromise, she said honestly. But the right kind of compromise. The kind that acknowledges reality while still pushing toward something better. I'm not getting everything I might ideally want, but I'm getting the opportunity to work toward those ideals rather than simply dreaming about them. What about love? He asked suddenly, the question surprising them both. The contract addresses authority and responsibility and shared governance. But what about the personal relationship that makes the political alliance meaningful? What about it? Is it enough? What we have, what we're building, is it enough to sustain the kind of partnership this contract envisions? Elira was quiet for a long moment, her attention apparently focused on a loose thread in the banners. Embroidery. When she finally looked at him, her expression was serious but not worried. I think love is something that grows rather than something that simply exists, she said carefully. What we have now is genuine affection, mutual respect, shared vision, and physical attraction. That's a stronger foundation than most royal marriages begin with. Whether it develops into something deeper depends on how well we support each other through the challenges ahead. And you're willing to take that risk, to build your future around possibilities rather than certainties. I'm willing to build our future around partnership rather than isolation, she replied. Whether that partnership becomes the great love story of our generation, or simply an effective working relationship that serves our people well, either outcome seems preferable to the alternatives we're avoiding. The practical wisdom in her response was both reassuring and slightly disappointing. Part of him had been hoping for declarations of eternal devotion, passionate avowals that would make the political calculations irrelevant. Instead, she offered mature recognition that successful marriages required more than emotional intensity. They required commitment to shared goals and willingness to support each other through whatever challenges those goals might entail. 2 days, he said, looking at the banner that would soon fly over their announcement. 2 days to change the course of the kingdom's history. 2 days to take the first step toward changes that might unfold over decades, she corrected. What we announce will be important, but what we do afterward will determine whether the announcement was meaningful or merely ceremonial. As evening approached and the preparations for the assembly continued around them, Roran found himself thinking about the future with something he hadn't felt in years, genuine anticipation rather than simple duty. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with a partner who understood their complexity and shared his determination to meet them thoughtfully. It was, he realized, the first time in his life that the future seemed like something to embrace, rather than simply endure. The great hall of Castle Ravencrest had been transformed for the assembly, its familiar banners replaced by the new standard that bore both Blackthorn and Thornwick heraldry. Representatives from every noble house in the kingdom filled the vast space, their conversations creating a low murmur that spoke of anticipation and uncertainty in equal measure. Roran stood at the entrance to the hall, watching the assembled lords and ladies through the partially open doors. These were the people who had served his crown for years, who had accepted his authority and supported his policies even when they harbored private doubts. Today, he would ask them to support something unprecedented, a voluntary sharing of power that went against everything their class had been taught about the nature of sovereignty. They looked nervous, Elira observed, joining him at his viewing post. She wore the formal gown that had been prepared for this occasion, deep blue silk with silver embroidery that echoed the patterns on their shared banner. The effect was both elegant and unmistakably royal, a visual reminder that she was no longer a village healer, but a legitimate claimant to the throne. They should be nervous, he replied. What we're proposing will change everything about how this kingdom operates. Some of them will benefit from those changes, but others will find their traditional privileges diminished. Any second thoughts? Many second thoughts, he admitted, but no better alternatives. Lord Brennan's preliminary conversations suggest we have sufficient support, but the final announcement will determine whether that support translates into genuine acceptance. Through the doorway, he could see Lord Wynne moving among the assembled nobles, engaging in the kind of subtle diplomacy that had made him valuable despite his recent revelations about manipulation and betrayal. Whatever his methods, the man understood political currents better than anyone else in the kingdom, and his confidence in their proposal had helped reassure wavering houses. "Your Majesty," Captain Gareth appeared beside them, his expression alert but calm. "All security measures are in place, and we've received word that the foreign observers have taken their designated positions in the gallery. King Matthias's representative arrived this morning with a substantial escort." "How substantial?" 50 men, all well-armed and positioned outside the castle grounds. Not enough for an assault, but certainly enough to send a message about their seriousness. The message was clear enough. King Matthias wanted everyone present to understand that he had options beyond diplomatic protest. If the Assembly's decisions didn't align with his interests, it was a reminder that external pressure remained constant. Despite their internal negotiations, any signs of coordinated activity among the domestic houses? "Nothing suspicious, Your Majesty. Some private conversations that ended when our people approached, but that's normal for any significant gathering. If there's organized opposition to your proposal, it's being kept very quiet." "Good. What about the common folk? Any reactions?" "From the city, crowds have been gathering in the market squares since dawn," Gareth reported, "mostly curiosity about what will be announced, but the mood seems positive. Word has spread about the potential alliance, and people appear genuinely hopeful about what it might mean for the kingdom's future." The popular support was encouraging, but Roran knew that royal assemblies were decided by noble votes rather than common opinion. The lords and ladies filling the Great Hall represented interests that sometimes aligned with their subjects' welfare, and sometimes diverged from it significantly. "Time to begin," Elira said, straightening the circlet that marked her royal status. Not a crown, which would have implied presumption, but a clear symbol of legitimate authority. "Are you ready for this?" "I've been ready for weeks," he replied, though the butterflies in his stomach suggested otherwise. "The question is whether they're ready for us." The great doors opened at his signal, and conversations gradually died, as the assembled nobility turned their attention toward the dais where their king would address them. Roran walked the length of the hall with measured steps, Elira beside him rather than behind him, their positioning making an unmistakable statement about the nature of their partnership. The crown sat heavy on his head as he took his place before the assembly, its familiar weight a reminder of the authority that had been passed down through generations of Blackthorn kings. Today, that authority would be shared for the first time in the dynasty's history. "Lords and ladies of Valyria," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space, "we gather today to address questions that have weighed upon this kingdom for months. Questions about succession, about stability, about the path we choose for our future." The opening was deliberately conventional, designed to put the assembly at ease before introducing the more revolutionary elements of their proposal. He could see attentive faces throughout the hall, some hopeful, others wary, all waiting to understand what their king intended. For 20 years, this kingdom has prospered under Blackthorn rule, maintaining our borders against foreign threats and preserving internal stability despite the challenges that have tested other realms. We have been strong, disciplined, and unified in our commitment to Valyria's welfare. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. This was familiar territory, the kind of ceremonial praise that opened most royal addresses. But strength alone is not enough to ensure our continued prosperity. The challenges we face today, external pressures from ambitious neighbors, internal tensions that threaten unity, economic changes that demand new approaches to governance, These challenges require more than traditional solutions. The murmurs grew quieter as the assembly sensed that the address was moving beyond ceremonial language toward substantive announcements. Which is why I stand before you today, not alone, but with Lady Elira of House Thornwick, last surviving heir, to the bloodline that ruled this realm with wisdom and prosperity for 3 centuries before my family's ascension. The reaction was immediate and intense. Sharp intakes of breath, whispered conversations, the kind of surprised energy that filled a room when long-held assumptions were suddenly challenged. Several lords leaned forward in their seats, while others exchanged meaningful glances with their neighbors. "Some of you may be surprised by this revelation," Roran continued, allowing the initial shock to settle before proceeding. "The Thornwick line was believed extinct, eliminated during the conflicts that brought my father to power. But survival, as we have learned, sometimes takes forms that escape even the most careful efforts at detection." Lord Ashworth stood up in the front section, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Majesty, what implications does this discovery have for the succession, for the legitimacy of current arrangements?" It was exactly the question Roran had been expecting, and exactly the opening he needed to present their proposal in its proper context. "An excellent question, Lord Ashworth, and one that goes to the heart of why we have gathered today." He gestured toward Elira, who stepped forward with the composure that had impressed him from their first meeting. "Lady Elira's survival presents us with both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge of reconciling competing claims to legitimate authority, and the opportunity to unite our realm behind a vision that draws strength from both bloodlines, rather than perpetuating the divisions that have weakened us." "What specific arrangement do you propose?" asked Lady Cordelia from the eastern houses, her tone suggesting she had some idea what was coming, but wanted it stated explicitly. "A marriage alliance between our houses," Roran announced, "sealed by formal betrothal that unites the Blackthorn and Thornwick bloodlines under shared sovereignty. Not conquest of one by the other, but genuine partnership that combines our respective strengths in service to the kingdom's welfare." The response was everything he had anticipated and more. Some lords nodded approvingly, recognizing the political wisdom of the arrangement. Others looked skeptical, clearly wondering how such shared authority could function practically. A few appeared genuinely shocked, as if the possibility had never occurred to them despite days of speculation. "Shared sovereignty," Lord Brennan repeated, rising from his seat. "Could you elaborate on what that would mean in practice? How would authority be divided between the crown and the co-crown?" Elira stepped forward then, her voice carrying the same clear authority that Roran's had. "The arrangement we propose recognizes that effective governance requires multiple areas of expertise. His Majesty would retain primary authority over military affairs, foreign policy, and traditional royal prerogatives. I would assume responsibility for domestic administration, legal reform, and the social policies that address the underlying causes of internal unrest." "And in cases where those areas overlap?" asked Lord Wynne, his question carrying the weight of genuine administrative concern rather than political maneuvering. "In cases of overlap, we would consult and reach consensus," Roran replied. "The goal is not to create competing centers of authority, but to ensure that all significant decisions benefit from both perspectives before being implemented." "What about succession?" The question came from Lady Margaret of the Northern Duchies, her tone sharp with concern. "How would inheritance work under such an arrangement?" "Our children would inherit both bloodlines and be raised to understand that their authority derives from service to the people rather than mere birthright," Elira answered. "The crown would pass to the most capable heir regardless of gender, chosen through consultation with the noble houses rather than simple primogeniture." The implications of that statement sent another ripple of surprised conversation through the assembly. Abandoning strict male inheritance was revolutionary enough, Adding noble consultation to the selection process represented a fundamental change in how royal succession would work. "Your Majesty," a voice called from the back of the hall, "what assurance do we have that this arrangement would provide the stability the kingdom requires? Shared authority has historically led to division and conflict rather than unified leadership." "The assurance lies in the foundation upon which the arrangement is built," Roran replied. "Not political convenience or coerced alliance, but genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared vision for what this kingdom can become." "And what vision is that?" Lord Ashworth asked. Elira stepped forward again, her expression taking on the intensity that had first caught his attention in the cells weeks before. "A kingdom where justice depends on merit rather than birth, where prosperity is shared rather than hoarded, where the crown serves the people instead of the people serving the crown." The Thornwick tradition of wise governance combined with the Blackthorn's strength in leadership, creating something neither bloodline could achieve alone. The words hung in the air like a challenge, demanding that everyone present choose between the familiar limitations of current arrangements and the uncertain possibilities of genuine reform. Suddenly, the great doors at the far end of the hall burst open with a crash that echoed through the vast space. Armed men in foreign colors poured through the entrance, their weapons drawn and their intentions unmistakably hostile. "In the name of King Matthias of Aldemore," their leader shouted, his voice carrying across the sudden chaos, "we claim protection of the rightful heir to the throne of Valyria, unlawfully held captive by usurpers who have forfeited their right to rule through tyranny and oppression." The moment of shocked silence that followed the intrusion was broken by the sound of chains snapping, not literal chains, but the invisible bonds that had held the kingdom in patterns of fear and submission for 2 decades. Elira stepped forward, not away from the armed men, her voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected authority. "I am Elira of House Thornwick," she declared, her words carrying to every corner of the great hall, "and I am exactly where I choose to be." The foreign soldiers hesitated, clearly not expecting this response from the woman they had supposedly come to rescue. Their leader, a grizzled veteran whose scarred face spoke of many campaigns, looked confused as he tried to reconcile their mission with the reality before him. "My lady," he said carefully, "King Matthias has sent us to ensure your safety and restore you to your rightful position. You need not fear these usurpers any longer." "The only thing I fear," Elira replied, her voice growing stronger, "is foreign intervention in matters that concern our kingdom alone. You claim to act in my name, but you do so without my consent and against my expressed wishes." Roran felt a surge of pride and something deeper, the recognition that he was witnessing not just political theater, but genuine courage. Elira could have used this moment to claim everything for herself, could have accepted foreign support to press her claim against his. Instead, she was choosing partnership over power, unity over advantage. "Captain Gareth," he said quietly, his hand moving to his sword hilt. Around the hall he could see his own guards positioning themselves strategically, ready to respond if diplomacy failed. "Already in motion, Your Majesty," Gareth replied, his voice barely audible. "We have men moving to secure the exits and reinforce the main entrance." But it was Lord Brennan who provided the most crucial intervention, rising from his seat with the dignity that had made him respected across factional lines. "Foreign soldiers," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had served the crown faithfully for decades. "You stand uninvited in the sovereign territory of Valyria, bearing arms against lawful authority. Whatever your intentions, your presence here constitutes an act of war against this realm and its people." "We act to prevent war," the soldier's leader replied, though his conviction seemed to be wavering as he looked around the hall at faces that showed no signs of oppression or fear, "to restore legitimate rule and end the suffering of the rightful queen." "What suffering?" Lady Margaret asked, standing to join Lord Brennan. We see no captive here, no woman held against her will. We see a legitimate heir to the Thornwick bloodline, choosing to work with the current sovereign to heal old wounds and build a stronger future. More nobles were rising now, not in panic, but in coordinated response to the challenge their kingdom faced. It was a remarkable display of unity. Houses that had often disagreed on policy questions presenting a unified front against external threats. "This is not your choice to make," Elira said, addressing the foreign soldiers directly. "This is not your kingdom to save, not your decision to impose. Whatever arrangements King Matthias believed he was making, they were made without my knowledge or consent. But my lady," the soldier said, his confusion evident, "the communications we received, the requests for assistance, were not sent by me," she interrupted firmly, "were not authorized by me, were fabricated by someone who believed they could use my name and heritage for their own purposes." The implications of her statement rippled through the assembly as people began to understand what had actually been happening. King Matthias had been responding to requests for help that had never been sent, communications that had been forged, to justify intervention that served his interests rather than any legitimate rescue mission. "Lord Wynne," Roran said, his voice carrying enough menace to cut through the political niceties that usually governed such exchanges. "Perhaps you could explain to our uninvited guests how such communications might have found their way to foreign courts." All eyes turned to his chief advisor, who had gone very pale as the full scope of his manipulations became clear. For the first time since Roran had known him, Wynne appeared to have been caught completely off guard by developments he hadn't anticipated. "Your Majesty," he began, but Elira cut him off. "Lord Wynne has been playing a complex game," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "managing multiple parties, creating crises that would justify the solutions he preferred, manipulating both domestic and foreign interests to serve what he believed were the kingdom's needs." "You knew?" Roran asked. "I suspected. The question was whether to expose his methods or simply ensure they served our purposes rather than his." She turned to address the assembled nobles directly. "The choice we're making today, the alliance between our houses, the commitment to shared governance, this choice is ours, made freely and with full knowledge of the alternatives. The alternatives being civil war, foreign invasion, or continued internal division that weakens us against external threats," Lord Ashworth observed, apparently having reached his own conclusions about the political dynamics at play. "Precisely," Roran confirmed. "What we're offering is not surrender to external pressure, but a solution that serves our kingdom's interests while making such pressure irrelevant." The foreign soldiers were looking increasingly uncomfortable as they realized their rescue mission had become a diplomatic incident with no clear resolution. Their leader seemed to be weighing his options, trying to determine whether withdrawal or persistence would better serve his king's interests. "Perhaps," Lady Cordelia suggested, "our guests would benefit from understanding exactly what arrangement Lady Elira has freely chosen, so they can report accurately to their sovereign about the situation they found here." It was a diplomatic way of offering the soldiers a face-saving exit, while ensuring that King Matthias would receive accurate information about the alliance, rather than the distorted intelligence that had prompted this intervention. "The arrangement," Elira said, stepping forward to stand beside Roran in a gesture that made their partnership unmistakably clear, "is marriage between our houses, creating unified leadership that draws on both bloodlines while preserving the sovereignty and independence of this realm. Joint rule," Roran added, "with shared authority over different aspects of governance, collaborative decision-making on matters of common concern, and a commitment to reforms that serve all our people rather than simply maintaining existing privileges, and succession based on merit and consultation rather than simple inheritance." Elira continued, ensuring that future rulers will earn their authority through service rather than claiming it through birth alone. The comprehensive nature of their proposal seemed to register with the foreign soldiers as something far more sophisticated than the simple rescue mission they had been sent to accomplish. This wasn't a captive waiting to be freed, but a legitimate sovereign choosing to reshape her kingdom's future through alliance rather than conquest. This information will be conveyed to King Matthias, their leader said finally, apparently recognizing that his mission had become untenable, along with our observations about the voluntary nature of the arrangements we've witnessed. Excellent, Lord Brennan said smoothly. And perhaps you could also convey our hope that King Matthias will find these arrangements as beneficial to regional stability as we believe they will be. A united Valeria makes a far better neighbor than a divided one. The diplomatic language barely concealed the underlying message. Attempts at intervention would face unified resistance rather than the internal division Matthias had been counting on. The foreign soldiers began withdrawing, their orderly retreat suggesting professional training rather than mercenary opportunism. As the great doors closed behind them, the assembly erupted in conversations that had been suppressed during the tense confrontation. But these were not the worried discussions of people uncertain about their future. They were the energetic exchanges of people who had just witnessed their kingdom successfully handle a crisis through unity rather than force. "Well," Lord Wynne said quietly, his usual composure finally returning as he realized that his manipulations had ultimately served their intended purpose despite being exposed. "I suppose that settles the question of foreign intervention." "It settles more than that," Roran replied, looking out over the assembly where nobles were expressing enthusiastic support for the alliance with a fervor that had been absent during the formal presentations. "It demonstrates what this kingdom can accomplish when we work together, instead of simply enduring whatever arrangements tradition has imposed on us." The broken chains Elira had mentioned were not just metaphorical, they were the actual constraints that had limited the kingdom's possibilities for decades. The willingness to challenge those constraints, to choose partnership over domination and growth over mere stability, had just proven itself in the most practical way possible. "Shall we proceed with the formal vote?" Lady Margaret asked, though the question seemed almost unnecessary given the mood in the hall. "By all means," Elira said, her smile carrying the satisfaction of someone who had just seen her deepest hopes validated by reality. "Though I suspect the outcome is no longer in doubt." As the nobles prepared to cast their ballots on the most significant political decision in a generation, Roran found himself thinking about the future with genuine excitement rather than mere duty. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Not just him and Elira, but an entire kingdom that had chosen hope over habit, partnership over power, and the possibility of genuine improvement over the comfortable limitations of what had always been. The crown that had felt so heavy on his head that morning now seemed to carry a different kind of weight. Not the burden of absolute authority, but the responsibility that came with shared leadership in service to something larger than personal ambition. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of weight he was ready to bear. 6 months after the assembly, the peace treaty scroll lay spread across Elira's desk like a map of possibilities made real. The formal language couldn't capture the transformation that had swept through the kingdom, but the specific provisions told their own story. Expanded rights for common folk, reformed legal procedures that treated all citizens equally regardless of birth, economic policies that encouraged growth rather than simply extracting tribute from those least able to pay. "The northern duchies have exceeded their quota for winter grain distribution," Captain Gareth reported, setting down the latest administrative summaries. "Apparently, the certainty of fair compensation has motivated farmers to plant more than they need for their own survival." Roran looked up from his own paperwork. Military reports that showed reduced tensions along every border as neighboring kingdoms adjusted to the reality of a unified, stable Valyria. And the Eastern Territories? Similar story. Production up, unrest down, voluntary compliance with royal edicts at levels we haven't seen in decades. Gareth's smile carried genuine satisfaction. Turns out people work harder when they believe their efforts will be rewarded, rather than simply confiscated. Revolutionary thinking, Elira observed with gentle irony, not looking up from the legal reforms she was reviewing. Who could have predicted that treating people fairly would make them more cooperative? The changes hadn't been without challenges. Several noble houses had initially resisted reforms that reduced their traditional privileges, and implementing new policies across a kingdom accustomed to operating differently had required patience and persistent effort. But the results spoke for themselves. Prosperity was rising, internal conflicts were decreasing, and the kingdom's reputation among its neighbors had shifted from grudging respect to genuine admiration. "Any word from King Matthias?" Roran asked. "He's requested a formal audience," Gareth replied. "Apparently wants to discuss trade agreements and mutual defense arrangements." His tone was quite different from the correspondence we received earlier this year. The transformation in external relationships had been as dramatic as the internal changes. Foreign courts that had seen Valyria as a potential target for expansion now viewed it as a valuable partner for cooperation. The kingdom's combination of military strength and internal stability made it an attractive ally rather than a tempting victim. "Schedule the audience for next week," Elira said, "but make it clear that he's welcome as an equal sovereign seeking mutual benefit, not as someone expecting deference or special consideration." "Already handled," Gareth confirmed. "Lord Brennan has been managing the diplomatic correspondence, and his messages have struck exactly the right tone." Lord Brennan had proven invaluable in the transition to shared governance, serving as a bridge between traditional practices and innovative approaches. His steady competence had helped other nobles adjust to the new arrangements while ensuring that essential functions continued operating smoothly during the period of change. "What about domestic responses to the legal reforms?" Roran asked. "Overwhelmingly positive," Elira replied, finally looking up from her work. "The new courts are handling cases more efficiently than the old system, and people are reporting greater confidence that justice will be both swift and fair, regardless of their social status." The reformed legal system was perhaps her greatest personal achievement in their first months of joint rule. By creating courts that treated all citizens equally and procedures that emphasized evidence over social connections, she had addressed one of the primary sources of popular discontent that had fueled rebellions like the one in Millhaven. Any remaining opposition to the changes, nothing organized, she said. Some grumbling from houses that preferred the old arrangements, but even they're finding benefits in the increased stability and prosperity. It's hard to argue with results that improve everyone's situation. The success had been built on careful implementation rather than revolutionary upheaval. Rather than dismantling existing structures immediately, they had gradually introduced reforms that addressed specific problems while preserving what worked well in traditional approaches. The result was evolution rather than revolution, change that felt natural rather than imposed. "The wedding preparations are proceeding smoothly," Gareth added, apparently consulting a different set of notes. "Lady Margaret reports that representatives from every noble house have confirmed attendance, along with delegations from 6 foreign courts. The formal wedding ceremony, scheduled for the following month, would serve multiple purposes beyond celebrating their personal union. It would be a public demonstration of the kingdom's unity, an opportunity to showcase their prosperity to foreign observers, and a symbolic conclusion to the period of transition that had begun with their engagement. Any security concerns about hosting so many foreign dignitaries simultaneously? Standard precautions are being taken," Gareth replied diplomatically. "But the general assessment is that our international reputation has improved sufficiently that most attending delegations are genuinely interested in strengthening relationships rather than gathering intelligence for hostile purposes. It was a remarkable change from the atmosphere of suspicion and potential conflict that had characterized the kingdom's foreign relationships just months before. The successful alliance between the Blackthorn and Thornwick bloodlines had created a model that other realms were studying with interest rather than viewing with concern. "What about the succession planning documents?" Roran asked, referring to the formal procedures they had been developing for ensuring smooth transitions of power in the future. "Nearly complete," Elira said, indicating a thick stack of papers on the corner of her desk. "We've incorporated feedback from the noble houses about consultation procedures while maintaining clear provisions for merit-based selection among eligible heirs. The succession reforms represented perhaps their most radical departure from traditional monarchy, by establishing that future rulers would be chosen through a combination of bloodline, demonstrated competence, and noble consensus. They were creating a system that balanced legitimate inheritance with practical wisdom about leadership capabilities. "How are the noble houses responding to the consultation requirements?" "Cautiously optimistic," she replied. "They appreciate having a formal voice in succession decisions, but they're still adjusting to the idea that their recommendations might actually influence who becomes the next sovereign." A soft knock interrupted their discussion. Lord Wynne entered at Roran's invitation, his expression carrying news of some significance. "Your Majesties," he said, "I bring remarkable intelligence from our Eastern contacts. It appears our reforms have inspired similar movements in 3 neighboring kingdoms. King Matthias's recent diplomatic overtures may be motivated by genuine desire to learn from our example rather than simply pursuing traditional alliances." "Explain," Elira said, setting aside her documents. "Representatives from Aldermore, Morwen, and the northern principalities have been quietly studying our transition to joint rule. They're facing internal pressures similar to what we experienced: succession crises, noble houses competing for influence, common people demanding better representation in governance. And they see our solution as applicable to their circumstances?" Roran asked. "More than that," Wynne replied with obvious satisfaction. "They see our success as proof that such reforms can be implemented without destroying existing stability. We've become a model for evolutionary change rather than revolutionary upheaval." The implications were staggering. Instead of being isolated by their innovations, they were inspiring other realms to consider similar approaches. The kingdom that had once been viewed with suspicion was becoming a center of political innovation that others sought to emulate. "What specific aspects are they most interested in?" Elira asked. "The legal reforms, the economic policies that encourage growth rather than simply extracting tribute, and especially the succession procedures that balance traditional legitimacy with practical competence." Wynne paused, studying their expressions. "There's also considerable interest in the marriage alliance itself. The idea that competing bloodlines can unite for mutual benefit rather than fighting until one destroys the other." "Fascinating," Roran mused. 6 months ago, we were defending ourselves against foreign intervention. Now, foreign courts are seeking our advice on governance." "The irony isn't lost on me," Wynne said with the closest thing to a smile he had shown in months. "My manipulations to create internal pressure for reform have accidentally made us leaders in regional political innovation." As the afternoon wore on, they continued reviewing reports that painted a picture of unprecedented success. The village of Millhaven, once a symbol of resistance and conflict, had become a prosperous community whose cooperation with royal policies served as an example for other settlements. The surviving villagers, who had been brought to the castle as prisoners, were now serving in various administrative roles, their insights into common people's concerns proving valuable in policy development. Captain Gareth returned with the final administrative summaries of the day. The Treasury reports show revenue increases of 30% over the same period last year, he announced. Voluntary compliance with tax obligations is at historic highs, and trade revenues continue growing as merchants invest in long-term ventures. Any regions still showing resistance to the reforms? The Western territories were slow to adjust initially, but recent reports suggest they're beginning to see benefits in the new approaches. Gareth consulted his notes. Lord Ashworth reports that his vassals are expressing genuine enthusiasm for policies they initially viewed with suspicion. Good, Elira said. What about preparations for the children's education programs? Proceeding ahead of schedule. The pilot programs in literacy and practical skills are showing remarkable results, particularly in rural areas where such opportunities were previously unavailable. The education initiatives were perhaps the most forward-looking of their reforms. Programs designed to ensure that future generations would have the knowledge and skills needed to participate fully in the kingdom's evolving governance structures. By investing in common people's development, they were creating the foundation for long-term stability based on genuine capability rather than mere tradition. Time will tell whether these changes prove sustainable, Roran observed, looking out the window at the bustling courtyard where servants moved with the confident efficiency of people who understood their value within larger purposes. Time will tell whether they prove sufficient, Elira corrected gently. The foundation we're building is strong, but each generation will face new challenges that require continued adaptation and growth. As evening approached and the day's administrative business concluded, they found themselves alone for the first time in hours. The chambers they shared had become a refuge from the demanding schedule of joint rule, a space where they could speak freely about both personal and political concerns. "Do you ever miss the simplicity of your former life?" Roran asked, settling into the comfortable chair that had become his preferred spot for evening conversations. "I miss the illusion that someone else was responsible for fixing the world's problems," she replied, joining him by the fireplace. "But I don't miss the helplessness of knowing that important decisions were being made by people who never had to live with their consequences. And the future? How do you see the next few years developing?" "Carefully," she said with a smile that carried both contentment and anticipation. "We've proven that major changes can be implemented successfully, but sustaining those changes requires constant attention to how they're working in practice. The real test will be whether our heirs continue building on what we've started or decide they prefer simpler approaches." "Speaking of heirs," he said, reaching for her hand, "any thoughts about timing for that particular responsibility?" Her smile widened. "Soon enough that they'll grow up understanding the new systems as normal rather than revolutionary, but not so soon that we're trying to manage both major political transitions and infant care simultaneously." It was a practical answer that reflected the careful balance they had learned to maintain between personal desires and public responsibilities. Their relationship had deepened over the months of working together, evolving from political alliance to genuine partnership, to something that felt increasingly like the love they had hoped might develop. "The kingdom our children inherit will be very different from the one we inherited," he observed. "Better, we hope," she said, "but different in ways that require wisdom and adaptability rather than simply maintaining existing arrangements through force of habit." As they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance in the fireplace, both were thinking about the future they were building, not just for themselves, but for generations who would inherit the consequences of every choice they made. It was a responsibility that felt both overwhelming and inspiring, a legacy that would be measured not in conquered territories or accumulated wealth, but in the quality of life they created for all their people. The peace treaty on Elira's desk represented more than formal agreements about rights and procedures. It represented a fundamental shift in how power could be exercised, not as domination over others, but as service to shared purposes that made everyone stronger. Outside their window, the lights of the capital city twinkled in the darkness, each one representing lives that were genuinely better than they had been 6 months before. It was a sight that never failed to remind them why their work mattered, why the challenges of reform and adaptation were worth embracing rather than avoiding. They had chosen love over legacy, partnership over power, hope over habit. The results suggested those choices had been wise, but more importantly, they had been choices made freely by people who understood their alternatives and decided to build something better than what they had inherited. It was, they both agreed, exactly the kind of legacy worth leaving to the future.